Of course, the technical complexity of a 100-story tower is going to be light years beyond, but you also have a team of probably 100, 200 engineers and constructors coming together to make that elevator happen. Versus
Right.
a private residence elevator, you're talking to a penthouse owner. They kind of just know that they want an elevator, but they don't want it to make any noise. They don't want it to take up any space. They don't want it
Sure.
to cost anything.
Right.
So the challenges vary a lot, but ultimately, at the end of the day, no one wants to spend any money. No one wants this thing to inconvenience them, but you need to negotiate and let them understand we'll get you the best elevator we can to fit your needs.
Hello, and welcome to the Elevator Careers Podcast, brought to you by the Allred Group. I'm your host, Matt Allred. Does your workforce need a lift? At the Allred Group, we are committed to connecting your company with top talent that matches your needs. Give us a call at 404-890-0445. In this episode, I interviewed Rick Sayah, Senior Vice President of VDA, an international elevator consulting company based in New York City. We discussed the process of making an elevator design functional for high-rise buildings, how building standards can vary internationally, and some interesting observations on how human behavior affects vertical transportation. I also asked Rick to share his advice for the next generation of elevator professionals. Rick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me.
I'm pleased to have you. I appreciate it. It was great meeting you last fall at the NAEC Expo, and to be able to keep having these conversations is a lot of fun. So I obviously have lots of questions for you. And you mentioned that elevators weren't really part of your original career plan. And so just, can you tell the story about how you first discovered the elevator industry and how that internship at VDA changed your trajectory?
Yeah, so at the time I was a student at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, and I was going through the co-op program there. I had done a couple different job assignments previously. One was like doing quality control for pharmaceutical supplies. Next stint was working for a small MEP firm doing general drafting and light project work like that. And then finally, as my third round was coming up, was interviewing with like a pharmaceutical company at the time, and then the opportunity for VDA showed up in the co-op office, and just looked very different, elevators and working with architecture and stuff like that. Met the people there and could just sense the vibe and the energy of the company at the time. Just a great little small group of people, all very intelligent and excited about the industry. And I guess that infectious excitement just rubbed off, and I really wanted to work for VDA. I even, I had a lock on the open job interview, but just something told me VDA is where you want to be, and had to fight a little bit. And my advisor was like, "Well, you should take the sure thing. Don't wait
Sure.
too long for VDA to get back to you." But luckily I held out, and the rest is kind of history.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, what surprised you the most? You're working on traffic studies and calculations and learning how complex elevator systems really are. What stands out to you as kind of a surprise?
Well, I guess the real surprise is just you don't realize how interdisciplinary, and you gotta have that like polymath capability, because one moment you're doing structural calculations, then you're figuring out horsepowers and heat loads and the kW of the motors, and trying to coordinate with the feeder sizes, all the while talking to the architect who's got these grand visions about how the building's got to look and how to move people through the lobbies. And then you run into the building code stuff and you find out that you're spending a lot of your time being a lawyer. So, it really calls upon you to hone all your skills. Engineering is a discipline where you have to integrate multiple different things in order to build something. So I think it really keyed in on that ability. I was always kind of doing all sorts of random things. And, I think this really was a great way to bring it all together, because it's always a new little challenge, a new little nook or cranny that you're going down to figure something out. Always comes back together. Someone's always throwing something new at you here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Well, and it sounds like you kind of saw the vision, caught the vision pretty early on. But at what point, or was there a point where you realize, hey, this is where I want to stay, right? This isn't just a job, but this is a career, and I'm going to be here.
Yeah, I guess it happened fairly early on, because my wife was working kind of in South Jersey and trying to figure out where we were gonna end up, and she had some opportunities down there, but we decided that coming back up to around VDA and looking at her opportunities up here, and, you know, the location of VDA is great because 'cause we're right outside New York City, got the whole world at your fingertips there, and
Sure.
just really settled in and made our life around here. I mean, I grew up in Jersey, Jersey born and bred, and so is she, and our whole families are here. So it just makes sense. We're sitting in the center of the elevator world. We've got the greatest
Right.
projects, and nowhere else I'd rather be.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, you described yourself as a chief firefighter, when problems arise. And I'm just curious if you could share a story about a time when someone called you because of an elevator situation, maybe gone sideways, or something was totally unusual that you were called
Yeah,
in to
well,
fix.
I mean, I wouldn't say we're called on for emergencies too much. That's one of the, benefits of being a consultant is at least you can wait till Monday morning to, you know,
Sure.
on the phone. Of course, everyone's got their water damage issues and stuff where they're asking for us to check their proposals. But, you get into these crazy design issues, and sometimes you get projects that they might paint themselves into a corner and you have to help them figure it out. There's a lot of zoning issues or design issues, scoping issues around what's the right elevator to use and how to make that work. Probably one of the coolest projects I did was the Skyscape Museum here in New York City on 55th Street and 8th Avenue.
Mhm.
It's actually a moving room. And before we got involved, the design team had already kind of fixated on this idea of a big, like 70,000 pound, I forget how big it was, but it was at least, you know, 400 square feet or something of a room.
Wow. Wow.
They wanted this stageless elevator system to operate it, and stuff like that's done in Broadway theaters and stuff, but never for public elevators.
Okay.
Trying to figure it out, coordinate with the manufacturer, figure out how we could pull it off. Eventually, yeah, you put all the pieces together and it turned out to be a successful project. So,
No, that sounds like a lot of fun. I'll have to go visit that next time I'm
yeah,
in town.
yeah,
Very cool. Very cool. I'm imagining at this point. And I mean, you talked about different codes and different projects, and you've worked on things all around the world, right? So you've probably seen some very different laws, rules, codes. Oh, we can't do this here because of that, and it's like
yeah.
what?
Well, yeah. I mean, the codes themselves, are a mishmash. I think a lot of other, in the States, the legal environment and everything is such that the codes are much more strictly adhered to
Okay.
followed. When you get into other jurisdictions, other countries, they're more of a guideline. Some or they haven't really been put through their paces, and the enforcement structures aren't quite the same or as robust. But at the same time, that's where you bring in the international expertise and what you've seen around the world, and you're trying to deliver something that is better than what you might be able to get away with.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You've talked about working on everything from private residential elevators to 100-story towers. And I'm curious, what changes when you move from designing a small system to designing elevators for a super tall building?
In some senses, not a lot, because at the end of the day, you're dealing with clients and trying to make sure they understand the elevator systems that they're trying to purchase. Because
Hmm.
at the beginning of any project, you're just trying to, get it on paper. Of course, the technical complexity of a 100-story tower is going to be light years beyond, but you also have a team of probably 100, 200 engineers and constructors coming together to make that elevator happen versus, a private residence elevator. You're talking to a penthouse owner on Central Park South where they're not experienced in the business, and they kind of just know that they want an elevator, but they don't want it to make any noise. They don't want it to take up any space. They don't want it to
Sure.
cost anything. So
Right.
the challenges vary a lot, but ultimately, at the end of the day, no one wants to spend any money. No one wants this thing to inconvenience them, but you need to negotiate and let them understand, we'll get you the best elevator we can to fit your needs. And the general conversation tends to be the same. It's just the scale of it and how beautiful it's going to look on the skyline.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, and along with those, yeah, differences, I mean, you mentioned that a lot of modern office buildings now have gyms and coffee bars and amenities that send people kind of around or up or down or, down to the cafeteria. How does that change the way elevator traffic has to be designed?
Yeah, well, I think it's a complication that hasn't really been fully thought all the way through, because I kind of like to remind people that the job of the building developer was to get people through the door, up into their seats, and they'll stay there. They might go out to lunch, come back in, and then they'll go out at the end of the day. Now they're coming in, running up, going down to get a cup of coffee, going back up, going down to a meeting, going back up to their desk, and making many more elevator trips during a day. And that's a chaotic traffic pattern that all your destination dispatching and cool control systems and genetic algorithms and AIs aren't really able to make sense of, because it's just people going about their day doing their thing. And
A
you know,
lot more haphazard as you kind of
right,
add in some amenities. Oh, hey, we have a gym on the third floor and a cafeteria down here. Then, yeah, people are just gonna, it's not
right.
like a rush hour kind of situation.
Yeah, I kind of like to say we're seeing lunchtime all the time. It's people are just milling about through the building and enjoying the building, which is great. But it tends to mean we have to kind of redefine what the expectations are around the elevators. Because, yeah, you could add wall to wall elevators in the building to give everyone sub 30-second wait times to
Sure.
compensate for that, but that's not practical.
Hmm.
So trying to find that right balance with the developers and the tenants to, find that right balance in the building so that you can have an efficient floor plate that fits all their employees, but reasonable elevator service.
Sure. Sure. Well, and as you get, yeah, bigger buildings, right, and you got 99 floors, and people are trying to get back and forth from the
Yeah,
gym and
and
the
that's
cafeteria.
one of the difficulties we run into is with the availability of air rights and rezoning. You might have a footprint for a building that's constrained by, its geographic lot size,
Sure.
but it can be 100 stories tall and might look great on paper, but when you think about the 3D aspect of how those elevators move and interact with the building, you can just have a lot of congestion and traffic in that building to contend with, and trying to explain that and understand that and rationalize, maybe you can't have the building as tall, or we have to tailor it to a specific tenant profile, understanding what those possibilities are for that footprint.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. You said, yeah, it hasn't fully been thought out, and what it sounds like is there's still a lot of development happening, and I've even seen in the last 10, 20 years a lot more mixed use. So this used to be
Right.
just a mall, but now it's a mall and it's
Yep.
apartments and it's office building and
Yep.
and
Yeah, you get 3 or 4 different uses on the site, and they're each trying to get into the building from a different direction, but the elevators are all kinda still clustered in the middle, but everyone wants to have their own identity. And so, yeah, it's a difficult jigsaw puzzle trying to fit all those pieces together onto a plan, and some interesting challenges out there.
Sure, sure. Well, I guess that's why you get called in as the chief firefighter to kind of think through some of those challenges. And like you say, a designer may design something that's beautiful. Okay, but have you thought about this? And what
Yeah.
about,
Yeah, none of that is mathematics or engineering per se. It's
sure,
helping think through all those aspects and thinking a little bit outside the box too, because it's how do these different things interplay? Are there efficiencies? Like, if you stack the lobbies one on top of the other, do you have an ability to optimize that layout and, give them each their own separate floor for their identity? Stuff
right,
like
right.
that.
One, you said it's not mathematics. A lot of it's just experience, right? You've
Yeah.
seen it, you've experienced it a lot, and so you are able to speak to that.
Yep.
And as we're talking about, whole you could build a whole bank of elevators. Obviously, that's going to affect the economics of the building. And so, want to see if you could explain how elevator design can determine whether a skyscraper is financially viable.
Right. Well, the biggest concern is, they need to be able to sell the space within the building. So,
Hmm.
like we were talking about, a plot of land is going to have a certain amount of built area that you can put on it. So every elevator you put into that building is going to subtract away from that area. So you're trying to strike that balance of what is the right number of elevators to get to the level of service you want. And then each additional elevator is going to become inefficient. And when you think about an elevator is going to be roughly 100 square feet, if it's $1,000 per square foot in the building times, all stories in the building, even if it's a modest building that's only 20 stories, that's real money for each elevator. And not to mention the operating costs of that additional elevator because you're going to have to maintain it and inspect it and all that. So trying to find that right balance is tough. But of course, from a tenant point of view, they kind of think, oh, I want more elevators because I don't want to wait for an elevator.
Sure.
And the developer's trying to minimize that. And so you're constantly trying to walk that tightrope,
For
especially
sure.
we tend to represent both sides. So
Right.
yeah, sometimes
That's
on the same project.
right, right, right. I mean, that's why you do what you do, right? As a consultant, you're having to kind of counsel both sides about here are the pros and the cons, and you have to decide where to land ultimately. And so I'm curious, over the last 20 years, what are some of the biggest changes you've seen in how buildings are designed and how that affects elevators?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the digital revolution is obviously the biggest change, as the ability to have Zoom meetings like this is a great ability to project your power to a project wherever it is. But I think it's also a double-edged sword where the ease and ability to meet has kind of accelerated the pace of meetings. The fact that we don't have to erase lines and redraw and print on vellum. Now everything's digital and that you're able to make changes quickly means that building owners and clients feel that they can change their minds a lot more frequently. So
It's
yeah,
just a digital line, right?
yeah, it doesn't cost you anything to go and design 4 different versions of this building. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's kind of like a rapid prototyping of let's throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks. It's great to do, but the pace of that just continues to accelerate and it can be tough to keep up with it. And it puts a lot of demands on, especially a specialty field like ours where, we don't have great personnel resources. It's a small industry overall. So when you multiply that by the number of potential job sites or customers out there, giving them each that individual attention when they want lots of attention is a great challenge. But
For sure, for sure. Well, and back to the comment I made about experience is not everybody can just step into that role and know exactly what to do and
right.
have the experience. You can't just manufacture 20 years of experience and say, boom, here you go.
No, we're trying. Yeah, I think EDA's done a great job of trying to. I look at myself. They took a chance on me and brought me along, and it's hopefully worked out well from everything I can tell. And now to bring the next generation into the business, we're bringing on some design engineers and training them up, trying to teach them the ropes of the industry and kind of pay it forward and create a nice little ladder for them to climb where they can be the next great consultants in the industry. And
For sure. Yeah, and I can only imagine you feel a little bit of a pinch as baby boomers retire, and a
yeah,
lot of firms like the consulting firms were built around industry veterans that spent 40, 50 years or more maybe in the consulting arena, and as they retire out, do you feel and see that knowledge gap as experts retire and you're developing the next
yeah,
generation?
absolutely. I mean, it's not just on the consulting side, even in the elevator companies, there are those great minds, those little tinkerers who might be hiding in the basement, those little gurus who know elevators inside and out. They're getting older and they're not being replaced. And we gotta watch out as an industry that we don't lose that talent, that we make sure we're passing the torch on to the next generation and bringing them along because it's a complex industry. And as we talked about, there's lots of little nooks and crannies of info that you need to know in order to be successful and to keep these projects running well. And, if we're not careful, that talent's gonna move on and we're going to be left holding the bag.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Which leads me to my next question, which, if there's a young engineer or mechanic listening to this podcast, if they're in the industry, maybe they're thinking about getting in the industry or getting into consulting one day, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I'd say ask lots of questions. I think the industry is full of lots of generous minds who are willing to share their stories and teach you everything they know, and they're happy to do so. Don't be afraid about stepping outside your comfort zone and trying something new. Like I said, you might be very mechanically inclined. You can adjust the rollers and do all the stuff in the shaft and run the rails, but you also got to be able to handle the control technologies that are going on. Gotta stay abreast of everything happening in computers because it's all coming back to us as to what's happening inside the elevator. And you gotta constantly reinvent yourself and see what's coming down the pipeline. So, you know, don't be afraid and don't get stuck in your rut.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I'm sure they feel that, just like I said, with baby boomers retiring, and you can't just manufacture all those years of experience. So there's probably a bit of pressure to ramp up quickly, ask lots of questions, read the code books, try to
Yeah.
drink out of that fire hose as fast as you can.
Yeah, but that's kind of was my ideal at VDA. I had great mentors all around me. John Van Dusen, Amit Tanyeri, John Beckman, Tom Stack, all these great guys who were more than willing to coach me through any questions I had and just looking over their shoulder, seeing what they were working on and figuring out what they did and then regurgitating it and making it my own eventually. So
Sure, sure. Well, and yeah, at some point it has to become your own, right? You have to use that knowledge and maybe even trip over your own toes and oh, whoops, I guess that wasn't quite the right thing. Maybe we need to do this instead, right?
yeah.
That's how I learn. Very cool. So the last question I have for you, when you walk into a building today, maybe it's a hotel, office, tower, airport, what do you find yourself thinking about in regards to the elevators, and what is it you're looking for?
Obviously, being an elevator geek, you're always kind of watching, just checking the operation, especially seeing how people interact with the elevators. That's probably the most interesting bit, especially when you walk into a building with destination dispatch, seeing how people interact with that. You'll see someone on their cell phone and they might not realize the elevator's arrived and how that impacts the elevator traffic because now they end up holding the door or somebody holds the door for them. You understand that that has a whole domino effect on it. General arrangement of the lobbies and flow through the buildings, you start to feel that a little bit. So, being in the people movement business, you kind of take your subway journeys and everything as a little more of an intellectual experience, or at least you keep yourself from getting too bored by starting to, understand how people are moving and those general patterns of human behavior.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, Rick, anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up today?
No, I mean, again, just to all the young aspiring elevator technicians and engineers out there, be curious and ask lots of questions and, respect those mentors out there that are looking to share their knowledge with you.
Perfect. Well, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate you being on with me today and wish you the very best.
Thank you, Matt. This has been excellent.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Elevator Careers Podcast, sponsored by the Allred Group, a leader in elevator industry recruiting. Please visit our YouTube channel at Elevator Careers or check us out online at elevatorcareers.net. Please like and subscribe, and until next time, stay safe.